Hi everyone, and welcome to the Athena with podcast. My name is Athena, and I'm a development intern at Three Pillars Project, and I'm also a student at Kingston University studying forensic psychology. For today's podcast, it's going to be a bit of reflection on a couple of points that were brought up in a Q&A session that I conducted with one of the trustees. His name is Lewis, so I hope you enjoy it. Firstly, Lewis spoke about growing up and how he grew up in an area that he considered to be quite a rough area, and how being involved in sport kind of shielded him from a lot of the crime he was witnessing or that was going on around him.
I think the area I grew up in, if you ask anyone else, is considered quite a rough area, but I often felt quite shielded from that just playing sports.
Hearing from Lewis and hearing his perspective on this is really interesting, because for a lot of people, that isn't the reality for them, in the sense that sport can still be a major part of someone's life, but they can still get hooked onto crime and get involved in criminal behavior or gangs or whatever it may be. And that was the case for one of the ex-participants of the program, Larry, who was also very enthusiastic about sport as a kid. And, he liked playing rugby, he liked playing football, but he still found himself on the wrong end of the law. And that kind of brings up the argument of free will and choice, and how two people can come from similar backgrounds, similar environments, and still go completely different paths. So that was really interesting. Talking about what he's doing now, Lewis is currently doing a PhD, and he's looking at the immediate effects of sport programs on crime. And by looking at it in a longitudinal way, as he's doing, as his design is mixed methods, that's something that's so important with what he is investigating, because as we all know, crime isn't something that's going to go away tomorrow or next week or next year. It's a lifespan issue. And, putting sport and crime under a microscope and kind of looking at it from a 5-year, 10-year, 20-year perspective is so important in understanding, what works, what doesn't work, and tracking these things over the years as someone's, going from childhood to teenhood to adulthood is going to be something that's really beneficial.
But it's a mixed methods PhD. I am doing all the research, which is fun but challenging, as you can imagine, during COVID. So the way we've done it, or the way I've designed it, it's almost like a story. So you start off with the typical literature review, which of course you're pulling your hair out at. And then our first study, we looked at profiling communities. So it was less about the sport and more so really preaching the idea of going into a community to understand. So we did a series of focus groups in that same area I mentioned, Tower Hamlets, and we done it with youth practitioners and young people. And this was to get a general depiction of what the key issues were, what some of the key risk factors for them joining street gangs and getting involved in criminal activities were, and also maybe some of the stuff that they wanted to see moving forward. And then from that, we were able to kind of generate a nice profile, which was study 1. Moving into study 2, we looked at how sports programs can directly mediate or alleviate these specific issues highlighted. So we generated a survey, which was quite long, but we managed to get quite a few submissions in, and also did interviews on the side of this with young people that were part of these sports programs. We done it with the youth practitioners once again, but we also managed to get members of the wider community. So we had a few police officers do interviews with us, teachers. And then the last study, hopefully I'm not boring you guys, so the last study, we are going to look at the impact of sport on the general life prospect of young people. So at the moment, the PhD is very, very gang heavy and social behavior heavy, and it looks at almost the immediate effect. But I want to really tell the story of what sports programs can do for young people or just people in general on a 5, 10, 15, 20-year perspective. Because if you get a young person that's maybe like myself, I entered sport at 10, 11, and it's been a part of my life. I'm 27 now, 16 years and counting. So it's one of those things where it's kept me away from certain issues, it's kept me away from certain circles, and I'm not the only one. So it's important to tell this story because I'm sure you guys will all agree, as you start to look into the sport for development sector, it's very numbers driven in terms of getting funding and getting support. It's always about how many people you get through the door. And, you know, we all live a life here and we understand that it's not a numbers game. Sometimes the impact you have on people is not something they're going to see after a 12, 16 or 24-week program.
Speaking about the work that Three Pillars Project does with their apprentices, Lewis spoke about how mentoring doesn't just stop as soon as you've left the program. It continues. And the benefits that has, not only to the individual, but to their families, the wider community, you know, neighbours, friends. And he used a nice little quote, which I'll let him share.
For me, and it's something, again, this is something I've always preached, but I think the attention to detail and the quality over quantity concept is always something that sets the best charities apart from the rest. And I think Three Pillars is one of those elite charities that allow, that really, you know, whether we get 2 guys through the door or 10, you know, they get that good quality mentoring service. They get that good contact time with all the members of staff. I think everyone here, you know, when we had a trustee meeting, the 2 guys that I mentioned were hanging about. They were in the gym. And every single trustee took it upon themselves to have a conversation with these guys. You know, you're talking about 2 guys that have come off prison sentences. Prior to that, probably haven't really engaged in the best of circles. They're speaking to, you know, people with very well decorated CVs. So I think I suppose the mission to really see these young men, or not, some of them aren't young, some of them are a bit older, but to see these men through their development. I think a lot of charities, specifically those that, and this isn't to dog any other charities, but a lot of charities that work with this demographic have the tendency to engage, help, provide. You know, they send them on courses, they send them to this job interview, and then they think their job's done. Whereas here at Three Pillars, it's, you know, consistent guidance through every stage. So even though those 2 guys or those 3 guys are in full-time employment and education, I'm still messaging them at least once a week. Their assigned mentor, Milka, who I don't know if you guys have met, is in constant contact, guiding them through now the professional workspace, because the journey doesn't end. You know, some of these guys, and I obviously know this from having close friends that have been through it, go through some really traumatic things through their prison sentences and maybe before that. So constantly guiding them at every stage of their life is something that I think we pride ourselves on at Three Pillars. And that, coming back to the best interests of those in any community, that our community leaders, is that we're allowing better citizens, or we're releasing better citizens to the local community, as opposed to just sending guys out that have served their time and haven't learned anything. And I think that is in the best interest of everyone.
The current situation with COVID-19 and, you know, the many lockdowns that we've had over the past year or so was also a big topic of discussion with Lewis. And he kind of spoke about how hard it's been to engage, you know, a lot of the young people over Zoom or MS Teams or whatever platform it is that people are using.
It's tough. I'll be brutally honest. So I work with different groups. So the school groups hasn't been as difficult to still engage, because as some of you may have seen, I'm still doing like online PE lessons with kids via Zoom. So it involves me doing star jumps in my dining room. But that's still going well. Like, we're still engaging a vast majority of the school. And then in terms of working with that larger community groups, we have switched to online delivery. And I would be a liar if I told you we're engaging the same numbers. We're not. We're just not. I don't even think we're getting half the amount of people that we were prior to to the lockdown. We're getting some new people, which is great, because obviously with the internet you're able to reach people on a worldwide basis, but we're not attracting those young men and women that, in my personal opinion, probably need it most. Because, again, this is a bit of a cheat code, because of how I grew up and who I grew up with, I'm able to know what's really going on in these areas. And if I'm being brutally honest, a lot of the young men and some of the young women that I work with are getting themselves very heavily involved in county lines type stuff. Because at a time where, and this sounds very cliche, but at a time where a lot of their parents aren't particularly on the high earning scale, they don't necessarily have professions, they have jobs. You know, their jobs have been decimated. They haven't even been put on furlough. They've just lost their jobs. And these young people, some as young as 15, 16, are being put in positions where it is literally either you go broke and you are forced to not have the bare necessities, or you do something about it.
I think for me, the COVID situation has really highlighted the importance of practical engagement and how important it is for these young people to keep the frequent contact and, you know, be consistent with them, because it is still possible to, you know, engage people through these means that we've been living by recently. But at the end of the day, it's about getting them into these active environments, into these active spaces with positive mentors and role models. That's key to making an intervention like this work, because without those things, a lot of these young people are going to look elsewhere for engagement and, you know, look to their neighborhoods and their parks, their estates, where interactions are less than positive. And this pandemic has kind of done a lot to show how at-risk groups haven't been supported enough, you know, not just through the pandemic, but in general. And this has only kind of highlighted that point. Lewis touched on some really interesting points during this Q&A session and throughout this podcast. And I hope you guys enjoyed his reflections, my reflections, and I'll see you in the next installment.